All right, we're going to get started and see if a few more folks trickle in. But welcome back, everybody, to the Monthly Sync. Today's topic is all about something that I'm having a lot of conversations about right now, which is roles and responsibilities post-sales. What should that look like, and how does that impact revenue? If you haven't met me before, if you haven't been to a webinar previously, my name's Tash Evans. I'm VP of Customer Growth at Hook and host of the webinar. And I'm joined today by the amazing Joe Marcin. Joe, would you mind saying hello and just giving us a quick intro, letting us know who you are and a bit about your experience?
Of course. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on which part of the world you're all in. Tosh, thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to join you and to talk through some of these topics, which are top of mind for me as well as I sort of contemplate where we are as a SaaS organization and what it's going to take to grow in 2026. Just by way of introduction and background, I've been in enterprise software for the last 25 years. For the last 10 years, I've held revenue leadership roles as chief revenue officer across 3 different software companies, all of which were on growth missions to exceed 100 million in revenue and become unicorns in valuation. So it's been a fun ride, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Nice. And I absolutely love that we have a CRO or an ex-CRO, a tenured CRO coming in to talk about post-sales. So I think that's extra special today. We're going to start big picture and work our way into some of the more specifics. So if we think about some of the core or the typical post-sales roles, customer success manager, account manager, renewals manager, tell me broadly, in your opinion, what do you see as their distinct roles and responsibilities if you were to summarize it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that there's not necessarily a one size fits all. I have a point of view on some things that have worked well in organizations that I've led.
Yeah.
And also, I've seen different things work in other companies. So I really do think it takes a moment for a team to sit down and really decide what's appropriate for this business at this stage of growth based on the type of companies you're selling to and the expectations that your customers have. That all said, one of the things I like to do is challenge my teams to come together and really get serious about what is the one thing that each of these functions is responsible for. And we did it in a very structured way where I actually had each of the stakeholders involved come up with one word, a singular word that describes what the ultimate function is of the CSM, the renewal manager, and the account manager. And it was really interesting because they struggled. A lot of them came up with 3 words, 4 words, 5 words, and I kept pushing them. I said, no, we want one word. One singular word. If you could peel back all the different things that these functions do, what's the one thing that is most important? And when we got down to it, and this was, with one of the organizations that I was leading very recently, when we got down to it, we decided that account management, the one word was growth. Renewal manager, the one word was retention. And for customer success, the one word was, it was sort of a debate between value or outcomes, but the connotation was the same. And so when you get down to kind of that singular view, you have a really good understanding of what the mission statement is going to be for that function. And so from there, we built mission statements. And then off of those mission statements, we define what are the roles and responsibilities of that function. And then from there, you start to build the handshakes between the different functions. Okay, this function does X, Y, and Z. How does that interrelate with the A, B, C functions of this other role? And what are the ways in which those 2 roles collaborate in the context of driving value for the customer? So at the end of the day, in my opinion, the CSM has the most important role because you're not going to get the renewal and you're not going to have the opportunity to grow your relationship with that customer if you're not creating value for that customer every step of the way.
Nice. I know some of the names and some of the folks who are dialed in today, and I know that there will be some very happy CSMs and CS leaders nodding their heads at you saying, hey, the CSM has the most important role. So good job with that one, Joe. The one word piece is really interesting, and I've never heard of anyone leverage that as a technique to define roles and responsibilities. We're going to come back to that and how that then relates to, you talked about linking it to a mission and then to the kind of like trade-offs or handoffs between each team. We're going to come back to that. But you mentioned, okay, you've got your point of view, and then obviously it depends, right? There's nuances based on the organization and what they're trying to achieve and their size and their scale. Maybe talk us through some of those nuances and where you adapt your point of view based on the size of an organization or some of the challenges they're facing?
Yeah, sure. So some of it does have to do with stage of growth. There are some companies where I would argue every company has a need for an account manager, a CSM, and a renewals manager, but not every company is at the size and stage of growth where they can fund three different individual headcounts. And so sometimes you have the functions, but they sit within a singular person. And I think it's really important to understand where you are from a growth standpoint, where you are from a budgetary standpoint, and what the business can ultimately support as you think about organizational design. That said, I think it's also important to not just look through the lens of your finance team's budget, but also to look through the lens of your customer expectation. If you're a small company, but you're selling to the Fortune 100, they're going to have a very different expectation than if you're a small company and you're selling to mom and pop shops at $5,000 a subscription. And so I think you need to be very thoughtful about who your audience is, what their expectations are, and how you support that with the organizational design. As I sort of think about, some of the teams that I've been a part of, we had a fairly wide range of revenue profiles within the customer base that we were supporting, and so we had to kind of look at those different segments organizationally through a different lens. And so we would invest more cycles and put more resources behind opportunities with customers that were, much larger in scope, and ultimately we'd either have potentially the larger ARR, which is, a way of measuring the value of that customer, but sometimes, and more importantly, the brand recognition. Maybe that company is not spending a lot of money with us today, but when you mention that we work with XYZ company, the whole world knows who you're talking about. And sometimes that carries more weight than the dollar value that the customer is spending with you in a subscription.
Yeah, really interesting. And so it's interesting that you say you think, in theory, every company warrants having an account manager, a CSM, a renewals manager. Obviously, some of that depends on the size. I'm wondering what your opinion is on the dependency of that on the profile of CSM that you've hired. And I ask that because I'm a big fan of hiring more commercial CSMs, so folks who are more than capable, if we wanted them to, of negotiating and closing a renewal or negotiating and closing an upsell. And so does any of your dependencies factor that in? Or would you always say that, hey, even if your CSM is commercial, it warrants having an account manager, it warrants having a renewal manager? Or again, does that depend on the size and scale of the organization?
I think it still does go back to, kind of that dependency around where is the company in their stage of growth. I've seen this with, really with any of the functions, with CSMs, with account managers, with renewal managers. A lot of times they have skill sets that bleed into the other functions. And in some cases where your organization is small, growing, it may not be able to fund having individual people in those respective roles. It may very well make sense to have a single person wearing multiple hats. That said, as your organization grows and matures and the expectations of your customer also evolve, the need to delineate between those roles, I think, becomes more important. And the reason why is because there's a trust currency that's built within each of those respective functions. If a CSM is ultimately commissioned on growing the size of the customer and selling, they have almost like the recommendations and the things that they're bringing forward as best practice are almost discounted through that lens. The customer starts to think, is this person recommending X, Y, and Z because they truly care about me achieving a greater outcome with the investment in the platform? Or are they recommending this because they have a commission plan tied to me buying something that's going to support this particular use case? And so as you get larger, your company grows and you start to get engaged with larger customers, I think it's important to think about the separation of duties so that you can truly focus on, again, going back to the singular word, focus on what is the real function that particular role is supposed to address.
It's such an interesting point of view because I see where that point of view comes from, and I have been there myself, and I think my point of view has changed. That I actually like a CSM who's targeted on upsell, and I think that you can position that to your customer in a way that's centered around value, and I'm tied in to helping you be successful, Mr. Customer, because actually I'm incentivized to help you be successful. But we'll leave that debate for another day, Joe.
Well, it's actually interesting, Tosh, because one of the things that I often think about is how do you incentivize people in these different roles? At the end of the
Right.
day, they all need to come together to deliver a great experience for the customer. Like that is what's most important. That should be the North Star. But
Yes.
if you have truly three different roles, you're, an account manager who's ultimately chartered with growth. They're going to be likely commissioned on upsell and cross sell. A renewals manager is likely going to be compensated for securing the renewal and retention values, and the customer success manager, who has responsibility for ensuring that the value hypothesis is ultimately delivered, is going to be measured on things like how much value did you actually create, which might be measured through a CSAT score or other things like that. Um,
Mm.
but at the end of the day, they're all ultimately chartered with one thing, which is ensuring you have a great customer experience. And so, whether they carry a quota or not, I think all three roles ought to be compensated on whether or not you're able to grow the relationship with the customer. All three roles ought to be compensated on did you secure the renewal or not? Because it takes a
Yeah.
team effort. If all three
Yeah.
functions don't come together and work as in harmony, you're not going to deliver the outcome that you need and that the customer needs.
I totally agree. And I think having some alignment between all three roles incentives is what every business should aim for, because it's okay to have the vast majority of your targets or incentive focus somewhere else, but you have to have something that's like a golden thread running through that pulls everybody to focus on the same thing. We had challenges at LinkedIn when we changed the incentive scheme so that CSMs were only focused on adoption and the sales team were focused on growth and net retention. And what ended up happening was you had some customers where the sales team were like, hey, we've got a huge opportunity to grow this customer. Hey, CSM, can you come and help me with this? And the CSM's like, they're 100% adoption. So like, I'm all good there. I'm going to go focus over here. And so I think that alignment is really important.
Agree, and I love the term the golden thread. That's magic. I love that.
I can't claim that one. I think I've taken that from somewhere else. You mentioned a little bit about like customer experience, and one of the things I want to ask you about is I'd often hear pushback from CSMs about having multiple roles. So where you've got an account manager, a CSM, and a renewals manager assigned to a customer, there's a feeling that that could impact customer experience. How do you think about how and when all of those three roles get introduced to a customer and how they work together so that it doesn't impact on customer experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a best in class sort of model, they're actually introduced before the customer signs their first subscription agreement. I think getting those people involved builds a lot of relationship transition, which I think is needed. A lot of times, executives will get involved in making those initial decisions, and then they roll off as projects get implemented, and oftentimes don't come back to the table. And so, by bringing these teams forward before the deal is even signed, puts them in the better position to maintain those relationships and also ensure that there's good continuity and understanding of what is the business problem we're ultimately trying to solve. I don't know, Tosh, if you've experienced this in any of your roles, but I've seen it quite a bit. You go through the sales cycle, everybody's on the same page with what is it that we're going to ultimately do. Then it gets thrown over the wall at implementation, and the implementation team says, so, Mr. Customer, what would you like to do?
Yeah.
And you design something completely different from what the original value thesis was.
Yeah.
And so then later down the road, of course, when it comes time for the renewal, you start to get questions around, wait a second, why are we spending this money? Because we're not solving the problem we originally set out to solve. And so if things get quote unquote lost in translation, and I think the earlier you can introduce the team that's ultimately going to, manage the relationship long term, the better it's going to be. As I also sort of think about, the roles that we've discussed so far, there's cases where there might be a fourth role that would be interesting to contemplate,
Mm.
and that is the role of the forward deployed or field deployed engineer. As I start thinking about the last mile problem, right? It's one thing that you have a point of view on the value hypothesis. It's another thing that you deploy, but sometimes you're going to learn things, especially if you're an earlier stage business, that's going to drive innovation in the roadmap and going to be very important not only to the successful outcome for the customer, but to ensuring that you're delivering successful outcomes at scale long term. And so, as I sort of think about, the team, yes, I do feel very strongly that you need the CSM, you need the account manager, and you need the renewals manager. But in some cases, I feel like you also need that forward deployed engineer who's going to bring that really deep technical understanding about how to make that customer successful and be able to incorporate the challenges that are uncovered along the way back into a product roadmap that can not only make that customer successful, but thousands more down the road.
And with these three roles or four roles, are you seeing all of these in effect working a customer at the same time? Or are there handoffs? Because I've seen both. Like we have some customers now who the CSM is involved until 180 days out from renewal, and then the renewal manager takes over responsibility for the relationship and the CSM steps back. But I've also got customers where all roles are involved at the same time. And I'm interested in your point of view on best in class there, and again, how that impacts on the customer experience.
My short answer is yes, meaning that there are points in time in the customer relationship where I think you need all roles active and on the field together. There are other points in time in the relationship where one role will step up to take a more active role and other roles may take a more passive one. What I think is really, really important, especially true as you start to move into the enterprise and strategic sort of end of the revenue spectrum. But what I think is really important is that you have a well thought out account plan for each and every customer that you're going to support. In that account plan, it talks about what you're trying to achieve with the customer and has clear definition of the roles that each of the stakeholders is going to play in that relationship with the customer. A lot of times you'll actually do I call them relationship maps, but you essentially build out it's an organizational structure of the customer, but it's also a mapping of the organizational structure from your company to the key stakeholders on the customer side with an understanding of who has political influence. So it's not just about structure and hierarchy, it's also about influence, which is really important. So I think again, in my opinion, I think it's important to align on what's the mission with this customer. Is this a customer we intend to grow? Is this a customer that we intend to promote as one of our marquee accounts that has done some, really innovative things with our platform? Whatever it is, you have a point of view. This is the plan for this customer. Here's the role that the CSM will play. Here's the role that the account manager will play. Here's the role that the renewals manager will play specific to this account. And then you have a mapping of, okay, the CSM has relationships with these 5 people. The account manager has these 3 people. Of course, it doesn't mean that those are the people and only the people that you can interact with in an account, but it means you know who's on first, you know who's on second, you know who's on third.
Yeah, nice. I call this divide and conquer. I think this is where you've got really great partnership with your sales teams and with your renewals team if that doesn't sit under customer success, to be able to trust each other and say, hey, okay, well, we've got this golden thread of what we all care about, but we also have focus areas. Let's sit down and map out the accounts and just agree now that you can run point on those accounts because that's more focused on growth, which is your area. You can run point on these accounts because you're more focused on retention and they're at risk, and I'll run point on these accounts. And it's just having that level of comfort in your peers that it's okay that you don't need to be on top of each other for every customer, and that dividing and conquering is okay because you'll complete more collectively together.
Very well said.
You mentioned enterprise and strategic in there. I'm interested to know, would you ever vary the setup of roles and responsibilities within an organization to better suit a segment or a size and spend of customer base?
I would. In a perfect world where money grows on trees and budgets are no longer a consideration, I would, of course, have an account manager, a CSM, a renewals manager assigned to every single customer, right? It would be very hands-on, high-touch sort of experience. But the reality is companies don't size their budgets for those kind of scenarios. In very, very rare instances they do, but for the most part, they don't. And so you're usually resource constrained in some way. You've got to figure out how to take the resources you do have and cover the number of customers that you have. Usually that means you don't have enough people to do the work that you would like to do. So how do you best optimize the model? As you're thinking about, your quote unquote most important customers, a lot of times they get categorized based on how much they spend today, or potentially based on the propensity to spend in the future. Maybe they're a small customer today, but they have the potential to spend a lot down the road. They tend to be, categorized, whether you call it enterprise or strategic or whatever title you give it, but they tend to get categorized into a segment of your customer base that's going to have a more high touch, white glove, red carpet type of experience. I would also say that you might want to do that with some of your more marquee logos where maybe they're a small spend. They're always going to be a small spend, but it's Amazon, it's Boeing, it's companies who carry a lot of weight. And when they say they're working with you and doing great things in the market, it's a value. And so I think the way that the way that you apply resources to organizations that fit in that segment of your customer base is going to look a little bit different than the ones that maybe only spend, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a year, don't have maybe the same kind of expectation from you that the larger companies might have. Um, and the way that you resource them, is sort of balanced in the sense for not only what they're spending today, but what their ultimate growth potential is, which is generally smaller than those that you might put into a larger category.
Yeah, nice. And I've got a couple more questions, and then we're gonna take some questions from folks who are dialed in. There's a couple of
Great.
questions in the Q&A already, but if anybody else has any questions, please pop them in there, and we'll get through as many as we can. Maybe this question is kind of similar to your last one, or maybe is linked to your answer. But you talked a little bit earlier about if you've got all three roles and you're trying to figure out the responsibilities and where everyone should focus, this idea of coming up with one word that each group should focus on, which I love. But what about if you're starting from scratch? What about if you're building a whole new post-sales team and you're trying to figure out which roles do I need? What advice would you have there?
I think you need to think about it sort of sequentially, right? In order to get to a point in time where you need to worry about a renewal, you first have to get a customer live, right? So when I think about post sales, well, you need a team that's going to turn on the software and configure it and ensure that it aligns to the value hypothesis from the sales campaign. Okay, that's step number one. Now we've got the customer live. They're using the product. The renewal is still likely some number of months or years out, depending on the type of agreements that you're negotiating. So although the renewal manager is important, it may not be necessary on day one. But what is necessary is that customer sees tremendous value and success with the platform while they're using it. So you probably need someone who knows a little bit about the domain space, knows a little bit about the product, and can help ensure that customer is maximizing the value of the investment they've made. Sounds kind of like a CSM or potentially a CSM and a forward deployed engineer. It just depends on, kind of the technical complexity of the platform that you're bringing to market. But you need that next, right? Then you get to the point where, okay, they've had some success, they see value. Wow, there might be an opportunity to sell them more stuff. Oh, wow. Okay, great. Now we need to think about who's going to do that. Now, to your point earlier, if you have a very commercially oriented and sort of commercially minded CSM function within the business, great. They can potentially do that, but they're playing the role of an account manager, even if it's a second hat that the same resource is wearing. But the sales opportunity doesn't come until you've delivered value. And so as I sort of think about it again, it's sequential. You have to get the customer live. Once they're live, you have to get them to ultimately realize value from the investment they've made. Once you've done that, then there's an opportunity to potentially grow and expand the number of use cases. And once you've done all of that, then you need to think about, okay, now how do I retain this customer so we can continue building on the foundation that was built during the initial subscription term? And so if you're, again, if you're sort of resource constrained, I think about it that way. You want to build in that direction. And again, you may have limited number of people, and so they're putting on additional hats as they go along. But over time, those hats will then be placed on other people's heads.
Yeah, nice. Okay, last super quick question from me, and then we're going to go to
Sure.
Q&A. When companies have all three roles, what's the biggest place they go wrong?
I think it's in not maintaining clear delineation between the roles and responsibilities. A lot of times I'll step into an organization, they'll have all three roles, and I see the account manager doing things that I would expect to see a CSM doing. I see the CSM doing things that I would expect to see a renewals manager or even someone from technical support doing. And I'm scratching my head because I'm like, why? What is the thing that you're supposed? Oh, I'm supposed to deliver value. Okay, how is escalating the support ticket helping with the business value that you're supposed to drive for this customer? Well, it's not, but nobody else is doing it. So you start to see where there's breakdowns in the organizational design, and those are the kinds of things I like to fix right away.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A before we wrap up. The
Great.
first one is, let's assume current state is a CSM is doing everything, renewal, adoption, growth. What signals should you look out for to realize you need to start splitting out responsibilities?
Probably when customers are asking for more. If you're starting to get to a point in time where your CSMs are acting as account managers, CSMs, and renewal managers, eventually they're going to take on so many accounts that they can't keep up with the work volume. And leaders are, assuming that you do a good job at meeting with your customers on a regular basis, you're going to start to hear that. Customers are going to say, well, we used to get, X amount of time or X amount of value from this resource. We're not seeing that anymore. That's your signal that you're starting to stretch these people too thin. It's time to think about either adding more people that can wear multiple hats, or
Mm.
as you reach a certain stage of growth, it's time to start thinking about specialization.
It's so interesting because, to your last point, there's another question that's come through that's similar to that. Their team currently has CSMs owning everything, considering adding account managers, but on the fence. They've hired CSMs that are really good sellers, but don't have the capacity to prioritize it because they're running really good books of business. So
Yeah.
it's like, does it make more sense to hire more CSMs who are running a smaller book of business or to hire account managers? How do you know which is the right move?
There could actually be another one too, which is to leverage your new logo acquisition team to handle the sales demand until you reach a point in time where you can add account managers to the org. I don't know that I have a great answer for you because a lot of it's budgetary dependent. If you have the resources to be able to add the headcount that can do the account management function, you're probably getting signs that that's the right time to do that. But if your finance team tells you you don't have the resource to be able to do that, then you're maybe thinking about how do we add more capacity from a CSM perspective, or potentially, like I said, how do we leverage the sales team that's doing new logo acquisition to come in and work alongside the CSM to handle, even if it's transactional, but to handle the sales opportunity that exists within the customer base.
Nice, thank you. There's a couple questions on how AI might change your point of view here. And I think you might have a point of view on this, and I might have a point of view on this based on what Hook does. But if you think about the long tail or the segments of ARR that we would have traditionally thought about applying a CSM, an AM, and an RM to, how do you think AI might change some of that?
Well, I think it gives you the opportunity to utilize your resources at greater scale. And I'm super excited about what Hook is doing. I think, the innovation that you've brought to market, the infusion of AI into the CSM role, but really across the entire post-sales function, I think is absolutely an opportunity for capitalizing on the resources that you already have and enabling them to do even more. As I sort of think about your question with regards to customer segment, we talked about this a little bit earlier around how some of your customers that fit into your larger segment are going to have a different expectation. They're going to be looking for that more hands-on, white glove, red carpet type of experience. As you start to go, down market in your revenue stream, you start thinking about some of the smaller organizations. You can become a lot smarter with how you deploy and utilize resources at scale when you start using technology platforms like Hook, because that can do a lot of the work that today a CSM might be doing manually to understand what's happening with a customer, where they're getting stuck, product utilization, all those things that people spend time manually collecting to really understand the health and the opportunity with a customer can now be done automatically. And so using that technology can really help you scale the organization and address some of those opportunities that do exist in the companies where you don't necessarily have resourcing to put a dedicated headcount.
Joe, I think you might have articulated that better than our sales team, to be honest. Last really quick one. There's a couple of questions here about, and Kerry, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get too specific into your question here, but a couple of questions on how do you prevent lots of roles stepping on each other's toes? Does that come down to this one word and definition of responsibilities, or how else do you see that?
I think having the singular word ultimately it becomes your North Star. And so when you do define your mission statement and then hanging off of that, you've got the roles and responsibilities, you should have some pretty good clarity around this person does X, this other person does Y, the third person does Z. Like that should be pretty well spelled out. But when you find that somebody is, struggling with that, they feel like, hey, I'm stepping on toes, or I'm being told by one of my peers that I'm stepping on their toes. If it's not clear in the roles and responsibilities, take them back to that single word, right? What is the activity that you're doing that's causing you to step on toes? Oh, I'm preparing the account plan. Okay, well, does that tie to, if you're a CSM, does that tie to value? Does that tie to retention, or does that tie to growth? And once you start to get them thinking about what is the thing I'm doing and which single word does it attach to, then you start to figure out which swim lane am I in, right? And then, of course, if you're in the wrong one, you help steer that person back to their swim lane.
Nice. Joe, you've been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. This has been full of so much insight. We're very, very grateful. Thank you to everybody who dialed in. I'm sorry, there's a last question that we didn't quite get to because we're already at time. But we will send the recording out. Thank you so much for joining. Please join us again for next month's webinar, and go follow Hook on LinkedIn for more tips and more resources. But Joe, thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tasha. It was great being here.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.